Louise Mandumbwa was born in Francistown, Botswana, and is an artist working in painting, printmaking, and drawing to explore ideations of home, figurative, and botanical works. Louise holds an MFA in Painting and Printmaking from Yale University, as well as a BFA in Painting from the University of Central Arkansas. Her work has been included in recent group exhibitions at Sakhile&Me in Frankfurt, Chile Art Projects in London, Spurs Gallery in Beijing, David Castillo in Miami, the Wright Museum in Detroit, Yossi Milo in New York. She was a 2024 recipient of a grant from the Elizabeth Greenshield Foundation and the Elizabeth Canfield Hicks Award from Yale University. She has completed residencies at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, the Sam and Adele Golden Foundation for the Art, and the Visual Arts at Chautauqua Institute in Chautauqua, New York. Louise lives and works in New Haven, Connecticut, except for this winter, as she is our visiting artist and scholar and teaching resident. Please welcome our 2025 VAST resident, Louise Mandumbwa.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Scott, for the generous introduction, and all of you for taking part of your time to be here this afternoon. Oregon is the furthest west I've ever been in the US, and it's been such a pleasure to have been in conversation with some of the people in this room, people that are students, but also the incredible faculty that support the programming through the Schneider, such as this one, and the overall department. My name is, again, Louise Mandumbwa, and I am a visual artist working through painting, printmaking, and drawing, and short-form poetics. Artist talks, in my experience, are perhaps the best occasion to reflect on a studio practice. It's an opportunity to lay out the time spent in studio and name the ideas, questions, and curiosities that we mull over again and again. In preparation for this talk, I rediscovered an older work that almost bookmarks where in my practice I started to parse out the themes that have become central motivators to my work. An iteration of a plastic bag that has become widely recognizable in the African diaspora called Ghana Must Go, or Zimbabwe bags, is something that I wanted to look at, referencing objects that were choice selections for immigrant communities in sub-Saharan Africa that had to whittle down a lifetime of belongings into what they could carry with them to the places they were going. The cheap and durable laundry bags were often piled into buses and in the back of pickup trucks, and almost invariably pointed to upheaval and migration. In place of the checkered plastic fabric, I worked with canvas and printed on it a textile I designed, pointing to my own family history. And on its defunct straps, sticker taped the words of poet Ijeoma Umebinyuo. And so here you are, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, never enough for both. In 2019, those words captured my dawning realization that the place that I longed to go back to when I visited home was a place that increasingly existed only in my memory. Rather than the familiar and unchanging sets of bodegas we called tuck shops and corner stores I spent months missing, was a town that became more and more difficult to orient myself to, as my personal landmarks changed, or in some cases disappeared altogether. I have 2 short video excerpts that I'll play that document part of the construction process for the work, but also contextualize my investment in the themes I explore with parts of conversations with both of my parents.
Zina langa ndine Celestina Seyala Mandumbwa, nichoka kubanja la ana 9, ndine wamkulu kuwasikana. Ndipo chodabwisa nichakuti mbanja latu asikana onse oyamba amapita kukayamba umoyo muziko lina. Ambuye anga anabadwa kuziko la Angola, anakwatiwa ku DRC. Ndikomwe anapita ndikupanga umoyo wao. Amayo anga anabadwa ku Angola koma anakulira ku DRC. Pomwe anali asikana anakwatiwa ndikupita ku Zambia. Ndikomwe anapanga umoyo wao. Inenso ndinabadwa ku Zambia. Pamene nafika zaka 24 ninakwatiriwa ndikupita kuziko la Botswana komwe ndapanga umoyo wanga na ndisowenza ku Botswana, ndiponso ana wanga anabadwa mu Botswana.
Crawford Mandumbwa kolishina lyangu. Kaka kachongo afumine ku Angola kuzana kutama ku chavuma ku Zambia akaliwani na puenyi nomba mama asemuke. Tata afumine halimbo lya mwaka mwi. Bachili kushikola ya milimo. Kango chuyamingwa kolele bene na kaka jami kuimbo wakaliwani na bisemi jami wamaputike kuzata kumbaka. Mama pena na masipa chenye bavulu bamiachi ayevulu. Ngochiri mu grade 6 mama atambukile chakavanga kuyaku kuva muri fuchi kuya ku Malawi. Myaka yakabireho mwaya ku Zimbabwe, mwaya ku Swaziland, mwana ku Britain. Obyatu nelenga mama no byatambulilenga abyapwile byamoza bene kubivwa. Yami kufuma muri fuchi chakavanga ngwaile bene nguchi kushikola ya milimo na kwetu ali ku South Africa. Myaka yakabireho kwatambukile chekana kabali omugwapile kuzata alikumbili imwe omugwapile bene umo mu kutambuka chame bangu hanyine milimo kwena kuzata ku Botswana nomungwa ngwatambule bene milimo wangu hanyine. Myaka yakabiremo ngwakalimbache na puami na mwaka wakabireho mwande tu Louise wakabanga mwasemuka. Olingana myaka 5 na iwana tuchiri mu Botswana. Tunatama bene miona yetu tunatama bene mu Botswana tuwakweka kazi kulitachikiza chetu kunafanenge kuna kakuwahileko momo tunali longesa bime bya bivulu bya miachia yeke tunali wana na kuno na malimi bene tunali longesa wana asiswana na malimi ka ku Zambia kaze numbaba na betu bakazambia bene ozeli fucha atakiza bene ya Botswana ka makumbi anongana ngera na ku Zambia ngana kaze mwana turako linge kutaza kanawa chinyingi chetu kana wapimbi takulikuza ngabene ngetu bakazambia nyi kanga chiri kuishi. Olingana myaka 5 na iwana tuchiri mu Botswana. Tunatama bene miona yetu tunatama bene mu Botswana tuwakweka kazi kulitachikiza chetu kunafanenge kuna kakuwahileko momo tunali longesa bime bya bivulu bya miachia yeke tunali wana na kuno na malimi bene tunali longesa wana asiswana na malimi ka ku Zambia kaze numbaba na betu bakazambia bene ozeli fucha atachikiza bene ya Botswana ka makumbi anongana ngera yana kuzambia ngana kazi mwana tulaku likange kutaza kanawa chinyingi chetu kana wapimbi takulikulitsa ngavene ngetu bakazambia nyi kanga chili kuishi olilingana miaka 5 na iwana tuchili mu Botswana tunatama bene miona yetu tunatama bene mu Botswana tuwakweka kaze kulitachikiza chetu kunafanya nge kuna kakuwahileko momo tunalilongesa bime bya bivulu bya miyachia yekho tunaliwana na kuno na malimi bene tunalilongesa wana siswana na malimi ka kuzambia kaze numba bana betu bakazambia bene ozerifu chatachikiza bene ya Botswana ka makumbi anongana ngera yana kuzambia ngana kazi mwana tulaku likange kutaza kanawa chinyingi chetu kana wapimbi takulikulitsa ngavene ngetu bakazambia nyi kanga chili kuishi
If any of you have moved house, you'll be familiar with how things get lost in the process, never to be seen again or recovered. In my own family, several moves across multiple countries and several decades meant that there was no real repository of family photos, documents, keepsakes, or archives that could point to any distinct, nameable point of origin. As the daughter and granddaughter of immigrants, the idea of home was one in flux. My family history, wrapped up in Portuguese, French, English, and at least 4 African vernacular languages, being Mbundu, Luvale, Nyanja, and Bemba, meant that rather than a set of coordinates on a map, my first point of reference was often a second-hand account, and a translated one at that. So what grounded my sense of home wasn't an attachment to built environment, it was the relational. When people would ask me where I was from, I always ended up speaking of the people I knew from there. The security guard that worked at the high school I attended, named Jacob, who greeted everybody with a warm smile. The son of a family friend that I watched grow up. And the older neighbor who watched me grow up. Rather than representing physical space that I could be dispossessed of or move away from, I was interested in the relational as a nurtured thing that could flex as life happened and be returned to in a way that physical spaces could not always. In the same way that writing allows for clearer recollection of information, drawing felt like a kind of committing to memory for the likenesses of the people I crossed paths with. When I moved to the US in 2015, portraiture was how I would come to be in conversation with the people I was in community with. It became an almost ethnographic exercise where I pulled in the varying responses to the question, where is home for you? From people, not just from where I was from, but rather a global diaspora. I engaged in piecing together a network of relationships that were built on shared recollections that largely stayed between myself and the sitter. My subjects who ranged from international students to first-generation Americans, to people with much deeper roots in the cities that I spent time in, shared with me a trust to represent their likeness with a kind of care that I honored. Those communities were in Conway and Little Rock, Arkansas, Richmond, Virginia, and Greensboro, North Carolina. The relational quality of my studio practice had as much to do with seeking out connection with people that felt like home as it did representing their likenesses. I was drawn to the emotive quality of portraiture and hoped to convey some of the interactions I was having by sharing transcribed excerpts of those conversations and sharing the words of the subjects as they articulated how they recalled the places that they had known for years before arriving here. But I was also reflecting on the reality that there were things that could not be conveyed in language or image, that these representations could not succeed in offering anything totalizing about my exchanges with them. So I built gaps into my paintings. While partly a stylistic choice, I contended that regardless of my subject, there would be parts of them that would remain unknowable to me. So in spite of my personal desire for clarity and care in their representations, I left parts of those paintings incomplete for how they might change over time and for the parts of them that could not be conveyed as something visual. Having learned to paint with watercolor, then acrylic, and then oil, I retained a love for working on paper and working with the tone of the paper as my lightest value rather than entirely covering it up. Light, most often, informed where those gaps laid. These reflections on what was immaterial and what could not be known through language or image became even more important when I started to draw on the few family photos and passed down stories I was able to source. I rediscovered this image of my mother and great-grandmother around the time, a few years ago, that my last living grandparent and my maternal grandmother was ill. Halfway across the world, I looked for consolation in what I knew about her. I asked often how I resembled her, if at all, and was told her hands looked like mine, looked like my mother's and my grandmother's as well. Our hands being a point of similarity was in some ways poetic, because I knew my mother's mother, who I'm named after, not through her words, but rather her touch. I began to think of a record as something that could exist outside of legible text or image, but perhaps exist as something embodied and transferred through affect and nurturing. Outside of a few sentences, my grandmother and I don't speak the same language. So unlike my father's mother, who I knew through the stories she would share, I knew Louise Sayala through her cooking, the feel of her palms, and the garden she tended to, where she grew some of the things she ate growing up in Angola. A kind of knowing that could be mediated through touch rather than sight alone guided the progression of my practice into graduate school. I made a series of works with plexiglass installed in front of them that obscured the work behind them and invited the viewer to adjust the proximity of the plexi to the drawing. The portraits came into focus with the contact of the two surfaces, like a memory becoming clearer in your mind's eye. It was a kind of knowing through your hands and clarification through touch, inviting the viewer to be a third part of an exchange, so it was no longer just between the artist and reference. In addition to figuration, I became interested in diagrammatics and drew from memory how I navigated from one point of familiarity to another. In this slide specifically, I tried to map out all of the places I lived in my home country before I moved to the US at age 18. If you were to overlay these maps with the places they reference, they likely wouldn't line up in a meaningful way. They instead acted more as a cultural asset mapping exercise than they did a cartographic one. I was increasingly interested in appending the likeness of my sitters with details that might facilitate a different kind of context. I was interested in the body as a record and embossed into the paper of this print the texture of what could be an enlarged fingerprint or perhaps some reference to topography in the environment. And I was interested in the kind of memory, material, and process might hold. If my practice was in part a response to the gaps in my own knowledge, then I was a self-styled bootleg archivist, working to contend with those absences through the haptic, through mistranslation, the embodied, alongside the recognizable image and legible text. So while my personal desire to clearly recall memories that were slipping, though I held them dear, motivated the tighter representational works I kept returning to, I began to seek out modes of creating that would allow for that tightness to fall away through process. Specifically, printmaking processes where the plate would deteriorate with successive prints, I'd been chewing on the idea of legibility, but it was in the transference of printmaking, in the mistranslation of a failed image, and the overwiping on a press, that the successive prints landed more as a presence, an absence, an approximation, than they did a perfect replication. Like a memory that conceals and then reveals something different each time it was returned to, I found iteration in my practice functioned more like starting a sentence over and over again in the hopes of remembering what comes next. And so I shifted the question central to my practice from where is home for you to what happens when it is a place you cannot return to, when all you have is what is caught in the cracks of your palms. What happens when you can only have a part and not the whole, and you have to make that enough? What I arrived at, interestingly enough, was in part gardening, specifically my recollections of my grandmother and mother's gardens. It was the practice of nurturing a thing in flux, much like how one might tend to a relationship, and there was something about a record of care present there. Evidence of time and effort embedded in the earth. I developed an interest in, if what you can see in the back there, botanical studies. What is pointed at or suggested outside of the floor plan are the many things that my grandmother grew over the 30 years that she tended that land. The avocado and guava and lemon and yucca. When she moved to Zambia from Angola, my grandmother brought with her the things that tasted like home and allowed her to locate something familiar in a new place. I found the words of bell hooks in a text titled "Choosing the Margin as a Space of Radical Openness." She speaks of private speech and public discourse, and writing as a space that allows her to recover all that she is in language. Of home, she writes, "At times home is no longer one place, it is locations. Home is that place which enables and promotes varied, ever-changing perspectives, a place where one discovers new ways of seeing reality, frontiers of difference. One confronts and accepts dispersal, fragmentation as a part of construction of a new world order that reveals more fully where we are, who we can become. It is an order that does not demand forgetting. Our struggle is also a struggle of memory against forgetting. And so the botanical in my work pointed at a land-body relationship, a struggle against forgetting, and a resonance that existed outside of language or narrative, functioning instead as a marker for some of the things we chose to bring with us. And what I chose to bring with me in these paintings was representations of people that I love dearly. I grappled for some time with how much of the private version of them I might want to share with an audience that had not yet had the pleasure of knowing them the way that I did. I thought about the temporal, so how to hint at potentially two moments where something is withheld, the version of themselves that they allow themselves, the belly laugh that they would share, as opposed to the dignified and stoic images that I often chose to represent in public forums. The botanical, or thinking about a kind of etymology, was something that allowed me to reference place, again without pointing at the built environment. Over the years, I developed something of a interesting relationship with space. Though I sound the way that I do here, and people often say I don't sound like I'm not from here, for 18 years of my life, I often heard that I sounded nothing like the people I was in community with. People would ask where I was from, and when I said down the road, they said that doesn't sound quite right. Where is your family from? And when I explained, they said, that makes so much sense. You're not really from here, you're from there. Never mind, I'd lived all of my life at that point in that space. So the relational, again, was the thing that I could hold on to. While someone might be able to say, you're not really from here, The same could never really happen when I spoke of the relationships that I shared with family and friends, found family as well in the US. And I think that's something that I continued to mine. In my earlier years, I talked about my practice referring to the human condition, inherent belonging, Ubuntu, which is a Pan-Africanist idea that we see ourselves in the people that we are around. And as I developed more language, I became interested in how the threads of language and longing, of the illegible and immaterial, material memory, and traces as evidence of touch could be crystallized in my research. Spending some time working on my thesis in graduate school, I had the opportunity to visit a place that had, for years, been the backdrop of many of the stories I had heard. Chavuma, an exceedingly remote village near the border of Angola and Zambia, was the furthest north I had traveled on the continent, and up until a few years ago, was more of a place I knew through my father's recollections than through any first-hand experience. In the African context, when people ask you where you are from, they're often asking where your father is from, what language he speaks, and what group of people he belongs to. Much like a last name, those details are handed down in a family and become yours. And when we finally arrived, I found that much of what he had pointed at were things that used to be there. There was a translation of context that didn't exist as something tangible. As we navigated the space, my father gestured at structures he had recalled being there, the homes now long gone that he remembered. Homes in Chavuma were made with unfired clay, and when the last occupant left, either this earth altogether or moved away to a different town, they were disassembled and made into earth again. Interestingly, what endured were the trees that he played on some odd 40 years ago. The clay that had been used to constitute home after home before being returned to the earth was an immaterial record. And what was enduring in those spaces was rather the gardens that were there, the yucca and sugarcane and things that people used to sustain themselves. Materially, I've been insistent on my use of paper for its ephemeral nature and in my thinking its relationship with memory. But memory isn't just about forgetting. There are things that remain, constants that stay clear in our recollection in spite of time. In more metropolitan spaces all over sub-Saharan Africa, it's incredibly common to see wheat pasted on every available concrete surface, 8.5 by 11 sheets, that points to the desires, hopes, and longing of the people that inhabit their spaces. It's phone numbers to call if you need someone to tend to your lawn or a maid to help clean your house. It's promises of potions that could potentially fix a broken heart or change your fortunes. It's a communal record that points to an accumulation of voices over time. And so thinking about the tension between the things that slip and what remain, I started to work with concrete, thinking about the palimpsest or stone in printmaking, about an accumulation of information, of traces that point to information that is no longer legible. Writing has been an incredibly important part of my practice, but very private as well. And so some of these concrete slabs contain in them words that I wasn't yet ready to share, a tome of sorts, end notes that contextualize or brought into the space language that was deeply important, but I was yet to find a way to share. That pointing of information that could potentially be shared, but maybe asked for a slower read, is something conceptual, but incredibly important as I continue to explore my practice. On speaking of translation, author David Diop said, "To translate is never simple. To translate is to risk understanding better than others that the truth of a word is not single, but double, even triple, quadruple, or quintuple." And I'd say the current format of my work offers a kind of translation that isn't singular. I began to work with configurations of multiple panels in a range of materials. Instead of pointing to actual physical space, folding into them the kind of wood or concrete and metal that would actually be used to construct a home without ever pointing to an isometric perspective of space. The work seeks resonance through surface, language, image, and failed image, looking to offer a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts, with the gaps built in. And a tension between something recalled with clarity, pushing against something that feels like it's on the periphery of your vision, that you can't quite grasp, can't quite name, in the way that I cannot name this plant that grew on my grandmother's steps for years, but I returned to find again and again every Christmas. Edwidge Dandicat talks about how the immigrant artist shares with all other artists the desire to interpret and possibly remake his or her own world. And I keep coming back to the nurtured thing that you choose to carry with you when you leave a place that makes the next place feel like home. To translate the context of a place, to make it so it points to what is not there. Where you hone in on the quotidian, like sugarcane, like yucca. I've never had a hand for making things grow, so I made in New Haven something of an archival garden instead, casting in aluminum yucca, like what my grandmother grew up eating in Angola and brought with her to Zambia, that my mother brought to Botswana with her, and that I brought as cuttings to cast so I could have something to hold on to. For soil, I used carborundum, a material used in lithography printmaking that speaks to the rubbing down of information or forgetting of information from a surface like a palimpsest. In spite of the lack of a green thumb on my part, there are things that I've learned from them both, my mother and my grandmother. That there are things that are grown out of loving, that even after they wither away, they have a way of coming back. That a grafted thing, a thing from a place that is not here, can grow with a different kind of tending to. That in some ways, I am a grafted thing from a place that is not here. I discovered on that research trip that my last name, Mandumbwa, was taken from a grove of trees found in the location where my family first settled. Ndumbwa refers to the tree itself. Mandumbwa refers to the fruit of that tree. And so the sowing of stories, the keeping of histories, and interest in the botanical seem more and more entrenched in my family history as I look into them further. One of the things I'll touch on briefly is the palette that I use. I worked in full color for a time, often referencing the photographs that I took, but wanted to closely investigate my relationship with the colors that I was using. I thought if I stripped it all away, I'd be able to think more closely about what color felt important to bring back and why. And it came back first in writing that I was doing, reflecting on all the ways that I knew home, its taste, its smell, the most familiar sights and sounds, and what color I would associate with it. I wrote that home felt like standing in the setting sun in my mother's backyard at the end of the day and feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, seeing the warm tones behind my eyelids. There's something unguarded about being outside and having your eyes closed. And at least in my experience, much of being an immigrant in another part of the world feels like a hypervigilance, a constant awareness and need to be aware of how you are understood, a constant desire to make sure that you're picking up all the cues. The only times I felt comfortable enough to stand outside and close my eyes was when I was at home. The poetics that have been part of my practice exist at the registers of annotation most often, but also phrases that were pulled from the interviews that I had with the different people I spent time with. They were part transcribed conversation and deep love and reflections. Of the many different questions I often asked the subjects I spent time with, I'd ask what word they had in their language for home. If any of you are familiar with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, it posits that language is not just how we communicate with one another, it shapes how we understand the world. And of those many different translations, my favorite has been Kwatu, which describes a place that belongs to me or a place that belongs to us. My practice, in a lot of ways, feels like a place that belongs to us, that I can invite people into to share in stories, like a fire that I invite people around to feel warmth as they exchange, but very often based on their interest and questions and interactions. That annotation looks like writing in ink on plexi, often handwritten when it's not embedded in concrete itself. One of the last slides that I'll share before we take any questions is really sharing how I thought about a collapse of material. I'm really interested in how painting can make me a better draftsperson and printmaking a better painter and so on. And so part of that collapse allowed me to work monochromatically. I worked with charcoal, but also liquid charcoal. I silk screened with liquid graphite. I painted with those materials as well. And what I think I really value in this experimentation is the idea of the multiple, not just iteration, but thinking of answers as generative and in conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Everybody, we have a microphone for questions. This talk is being recorded. If you have a question, I'll get the microphone to you so the cameras can pick up your question. Who would like to get us started? Any hands? Give it a minute to sink in.
Well, while someone thinks of their question, I just want to say...
One moment, Maureen.
I just want to say thank you, that I feel honored to see those images and to be a part of this world, especially the Kaka Betty. That was beautiful and very, very romantic. So thank you for being here and thank you for talking with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Question over here. Can you hand this microphone down and just speak close to the microphone?
I'm curious if you would speak more about your relationship to color. Is that too broad of a question? Or?
Could you be more specific?
Well, I'm painting myself and I'm just really struggling with color and how contextual it is and how each color relates to what's next to it, and I hear really strongly your interest in your relationship and to your family, and so I'm just curious that you don't use more color. Can you answer that?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
So color for a long time was actually a really important part of how I was painting because I was working with skin tone. And skin tone is often deeply nuanced and, as you've pointed out, relates to what's in the environment, the quality of light. I found that there was a specific time of day I really loved taking photographs. It created this wonderful warm tone, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was about that kind of temperature of color that I was attracted to. So rather than working with photographs and kind of pulling directly from what was on the image, I really wanted to think about, if I was working with a limited palette, what might be important to bring back first. I think now that I'm working color back into my work, it will kind of build in more color, but in a way that's more meaningful. There's a kind of indexing of moments that can happen. Some of the orange that came back in the print that I'd shared that had a map, that orange referred to a kind of color behind my eyelids as well. So thinking about an affective relationship with color was really important to me, so that when I circle back to using color, I can think about what a particular tone might signify and kind of creating a library of meaning that I can share with an audience familiar with my work. So they'll know like orange means this.
More questions? Okay, here you go.
Well, thank you for your talk today. Along the same lines maybe as the color, I happened to, just by coincidence, reading about Da Vinci. And one of the things they say in this biography is, to him, his ability to observe highlights was remarkable, so they say. And I couldn't help but see, honestly, similarities in the, it seems to me very important to you that the way you capture highlights, for example, the picture is in front of us, is that something you're very conscious of when you're working? And if so, how do you deal with that? How do you transmit that?
Yeah, I think in addition, first off, thank you for your question. I think in addition to highlights, I'm just really aware of light. I have a deep love of understanding how light affects the subjects and think about a lightness in the work in relation often to paper. So I'm making oil paintings, but almost exclusively on oil painting paper. And if you start working with watercolor, if you have experience with watercolor, you're never really thinking about entirely drenching pigment into your paper. You're working with it and allowing that to be your lightest value or tone. And so I think just from a technical perspective, I have a real appreciation for trying to retain that. It teaches me a lot about restraint. Some of the earlier paintings that I did, I would get to a good point and then I'd push it some more and a little more. And I was like, man, I should have stopped 10 hours ago. And so those moments of highlight almost act as an indicator for me. If I'm losing too much of them, I know that maybe there's an opportunity for me to take a breath and see if the work is asking anything more of me, or if I've been able to give enough information for that person to be recognizable to their loved ones, and enough that I'm not trying to like recreate the photograph in its entirety.
Louise, I have a question. You are a young artist who has recently completed your studies in graduate school. You've had wonderful opportunities to share your art around the world in prestigious galleries and locations. And you are here teaching with us at Southern Oregon University in the undergraduate fine art program. Working with our students, what bits of advice do you have for an undergrad who may be looking at continuing their studies in graduate schools and looking at where to turn to for opportunities for sharing their work?
Yeah, I think I got to attend an undergraduate institution in a smaller space. I was in Conway, Arkansas, and noticed with my peers in that department there was a desire to kind of network up, to reach out to different people in spaces that were further away from where we were at. And that often felt really difficult to navigate. We weren't sure where to kind of get started. There wasn't tons of professional development. But something that was really valuable was we had each other. And so before we were kind of showing anywhere else, we were thinking about how to create opportunities for us to share work in the context that we had access to. There was a student gallery that we showed work at, but we also petitioned, lobbied, asked for freestanding walls to be constructed outside so that we could have an outdoor exhibition. We're really interested in programming that was community-oriented. I think regardless of what you're aiming for, there's always a way for you to think about what is scalable and accessible to you right now and try it out so that you're not limiting yourself to, oh, I'm not in New York yet. And New York felt like a place that I would never, ever get to in terms of resources and distance. It just seemed unattainable. But I think really building out a community of artists that really care and being in conversation with the people that are right next to you is so valuable. I've heard from artists that are older than myself that it has not always been the case, but I've also really been fortunate to experience so much generosity and kindness from artists that were more experienced than myself. And I sent a lot of emails asking questions. And it's really true that you don't know what you don't know. So you have incredible faculty here that you have access to throughout the year. Ask them questions. They are a wealth of knowledge that's accessible to you. But also reach out to artists that you're interested in, that you resonate with, and see if you can interact with them to whatever capacity they might be willing to share. When you're looking at graduate schools, think about what you don't have access to where you're at. I was really hungry for a program that could push me, not just technically, but conceptually. We did some readings in senior seminar, and it started to scratch the surface of language that I hadn't heard come up in any of my classes. So thinking about like decolonial theory was something that I was interested in, but I'd never really come across. And so when I was looking for programs, I was really interested in finding a program that could push me further than I could push myself, and further than I could be pushed by the people that I was in community with.
We have time for more questions. Any other questions out there? Kyle?
Thank you, Louise, for sharing your work and for being a part of our community for this term. We're really fortunate to have you. My question centers around what you said about... Okay, sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. My question centers around what you said about what you're willing to share in terms of how you portray family members and friends and people who are close to you in the way you portray them. You mentioned that you tend to focus on maybe stoicism and maybe keep close to yourself in private, more candid moments of a belly laugh. And I was just wondering how you navigate choosing what to share with the broader world and what you keep close to yourself, and if that way of thinking about things has evolved over time and how it's changed.
Thank you for your question. It has evolved over time. I think initially I was really excited to share these people as much as possible and wasn't thinking about parting with those works at all. And then when I was in a position that I was parting with those works, I started to think about how those individuals might want to represent themselves to people that they didn't know. So what might be a really charming image full of character of someone like laughing, and maybe they're self-conscious about their teeth, but they're not worried about it because they're sharing it with you. I'm in a position where I'm thinking about just how front-facing these images might be, and coming from a context where people don't necessarily go to a lot of museums or have access to exhibitions. And so in their mind, even if I'm explaining like this will be seen by people, there's a very different appreciation for like exactly what that exposure looks like. So for a time I was thinking about what happens if people are turned away entirely and you can't see their face and it's just the suggestion of this person, and it becomes really intimate and private in that way that I know what this individual looks like and maybe a general audience doesn't. Or if there's iteration, maybe there's one image where they're visible and another where they're not. And I think how that's evolved a little bit more is my desire to represent them well comes from a place of love and wanting to share them as I see them, but leaning into abstraction kind of allows a little bit of that opportunity to share something that remains private but is visible in some way. One of the slides towards the end of the presentation maybe points to that a little bit more. I can pull it up. Okay, so the visual information is there, but thinking about how to mediate that. So the plexiglass was a mediation of that, where rather than the likeness of these people being immediately available, I was asking for some interaction, intentional interaction on the part of their viewer to be able to see that image more clearly. And then thinking about, okay, if it's not a scrim, if it's not a physical thing, like what are the other registers that can happen? And then I think being in conversation with all of these people, I want to know what they love dearly. And maybe the thing they love dearly is more important than knowing their likeness exactly. And so the sugarcane in this, for example, is really clear, and the figurative part is kind of falling away a little bit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Louise, thank you so much for your talk. For those of you who don't know, I happened to study abroad in Botswana, Africa, when I was in college. So I turned 20 years old in Botswana, so 1998, 99. And so we've been talking about that for the last couple weeks. Something that you said I thought just stuck with me so much, and I'd never heard the term until I was in Botswana, which was the idea of reverse culture shock. Mm-hmm. And those ideas that you just explained and explored and shared with our community here in Southern Oregon, I thought was just so wonderful. And I'm just so appreciative, and I hope that all of us in the room can have that as a memory of for ourselves of the complexity of a person, basically born and raised in a small landlocked sub-Saharan African country, but whose family was from other places, and just how amazing that life is that you shared with us. So I just want to say, appreciate that. And so the question on that is, in 20 years from now, what's your solo show going to be like in a town in Botswana, right? Where is that going to be, and what's your ideal as a way of bringing the community? So much of my experience there was about community as well. And so that's the kind of question to think 20 years from now. And then here's a quick one, is you said you drew on concrete. And I was just curious if you could talk about just that material, like that excitement you have for exploring materials. And then if you want to talk about 20 years from now or 30 years from now, I'd love it.
Okay, I think there was 3 questions in here, and I'll try to start with the material question. I was working on paper that was stretched over a wooden panel, and a lot of the conversation I was having with the faculty was about how light everything felt. It felt like things would maybe drift away. I also enjoyed a little bit of jeopardy, so I never sealed any of the charcoal drawings that I made, so if you touched it, oh well. You know, there's something that would be lost of the information on there. But I was thinking about the counter a little bit, and it was in getting to go home and do research for my thesis that I was really struck by how much concrete was in the space. Almost all the buildings are made of concrete and steel. And the conversations with my faculty, they talk about the gray and the plexiglass and, the suggestion of concrete that I'd raised, and they talked about it in the context of brutalism and how hard and cold those materials felt, which was very different from my experience of concrete, because that was like the warmest material that I knew, in part because of how hot it is and, it retains the heat. But also there's something about people building homes over an extended period of time because it's brick. And cement, it takes a lot longer, and sometimes people just get to the point where they've built the structure and they can't get to the paint just yet. And so you're seeing raw concrete in some of the more rural parts that you're going to, but there's such care and tenderness in how those materials are interacted with. And so I'd never picked up a bag of concrete ever in my life before I decided to make panels out of concrete. And I sketched out the dimensions, and then I went to Home Depot, and then I had to reckon with my decisions because I'd built the molds already. I had really wonderful faculty that had said, we'll help you figure out the concrete. And I was like, there's a concrete mixer. And they said, oh, there's no blades in it. You're going to have to use like a trough and a shovel. And so I developed this entirely different relationship with the material and just understanding the labor that goes into building those surfaces and thinking about objects that don't prioritize image, but like the object itself is the thing that is important. The things inside the object can become really important as well. As far as what a show might look like 20 years from now, it's interesting. I've talked with some other artists that are in the diaspora, and we talk about how often in the diaspora we're talking to each other. And when you go back, it's a completely different context. So the portraiture might transfer very easily as something that can be appreciated, but some of the ideas that I'm thinking of as far as like belonging and dispossession and like looking for home are really difficult to articulate to people that have never felt like they have left home or have never felt dispossessed of a place or have been there for the last 20 years and they've seen it change. And I go back and talk about the place that used to exist 20 years ago. So I think there's maybe a different body of work that kind of emerges from understanding my relationship with that place. At some point, I realized that there is no going back. I go home, I visit home, but the place that I want to visit doesn't exist anymore. I'm just kind of visiting. And it's a shift in conversation when people talk about visiting home versus going back home, because the thing that you're longing for doesn't necessarily exist. But for the people that are there, nothing has changed, at least not so drastically that they feel removed from it.
For our students and members of the Schneider Museum of Art, be on the lookout of a forthcoming workshop that Louise will be doing next month. Louise, thank you very much for your thoughtful and poetic presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for your time, everyone.